Guardo.
Dr. Warren and the Committee of Correspondence has sent us the warning. The British will be here soon.
Welcome to Drive Through History, Virginia. I'm Dave Stotts. In this episode of Drive Through History, you and I are going to drive through the beautiful Commonwealth of Virginia, where we will be guests in the home of three of our greatest American presidents, including Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. Next, it's on to Montpelier, the home of James Madison, our fourth president, and father of the U.S. Constitution. But first, let's check out Mount Vernon, the restored estate of our first president. We're here at the home of George Washington. Now, if you ever find yourself in Washington, D.C., you really should take a little time to make the short drive down here to Mount Vernon and allow yourself some time to linger, because here you will find the magnificently maintained estate of our nation's very first president. Now, the house has been accurately and beautifully restored, and it's open for touring. And the location of the home, sitting high atop the banks of the Potomac River, is second to none. Washington's home is built in the neoclassical English-Georgian style, but with enough originality and innovation to make this home truly American. The home was first owned by George Washington's older half-brother Lawrence, and he gave the home its name. Lawrence was a commissioned officer in the British Marines. George and Lawrence's father watched over the estate while his son was in military service and erected a modest farmhouse on the land. When Lawrence heard about it, he asked that the home be referred to as Mount Vernon, in honor of his commanding officer, Vice Admiral Edward Vernon. Admiral Vernon was considered to be one of the greatest military heroes of the age. Admiral Vernon was also affectionately known as Old Grog. History does not record whether Mount Grog was ever considered for a name. I'm guessing not. Anyway, when Lawrence returned and married, he set about a significant expansion program. After Lawrence's untimely death, George Washington inherited the place. It became George's beloved home and his ticket to become part of Virginia high society. When Washington inherited the estate, the farmhouse that we now call the mansion consisted of just 4 rooms. The process of enlarging and improving the house began in the years before Washington's marriage. In 1759, George Washington raised the structure from 1.5 to 2.5 stories and extensively redecorated the interior. The north and the south wings of the house were begun just before the start of the Revolutionary War. And just inside this window at the far north end is an enormous dining room that was completed after the war's end. Now, here's an interesting question. Why, with George Washington off fighting in the war, didn't the British destroy Mount Vernon? After all, he was America's first fearless leader. Well, the short answer is they thought about it. But the caretaker of the place, a man named Lund Washington, a distant cousin of George's, cut a deal. In exchange for not burning the place to the ground, he ponied up some hogs, some sheep, and, quote, an abundance of other supplies. In addition, 17 slaves left Mount Vernon to join the British cause. So, the house survived. When he heard of the incident, George Washington was quite happy that his home had been spared. In fact, he even sent a letter to Cousin Lund, promising him a big sloppy kiss when he got back. I'm kidding. Yeah, no, he was furious. In fact, he even wrote this in a letter. It would have been a less painful circumstance to me to have heard that in consequence of your non-compliance with their request, they had burnt my houses and laid the plantation in ruins. You ought to have considered yourself as my representative. and should have reflected on the bad example of communicating with the enemy. Later, Washington transformed the modest wood exterior of the mansion through a process known as rustification. He replaced the original plain wooden siding with bevel-edged pine blocks that had been coated with a mixture of paint and sand to give a faux stone finish. Then Washington added one of Mount Vernon's most recognizable features, a stunning two-story porch, or piazza, overlooking the Potomac. Here, family and guests would gather in warm weather to enjoy the breeze off the river. On top of the house, we see another of Washington's additions, a cupola, serving both a decorative and practical purpose. The cupola brought light into the house and, with its windows open, helped cool the house on hot Virginia summer days. After the Revolutionary War, Washington added to the mansion its final crowning touch, a dove of peace weather vane atop the cupola.
In designing his estate, Washington organized the buildings, the lanes, and the gardens in such a way as to reflect both the practical and the aesthetic sides of his nature. He sought to organize a landscape that brought together beauty and functionality in a serene, harmonious setting. It's even pretty when it rains. It is estimated that during his 2 terms as President of the United States, from 1789 to 1797, that George Washington spent some 434 days in residence here at Mount Vernon. Today, the mansion has been restored to its appearance in 1799, the last year of Washington's life.
The grounds are lush and peaceful, and they include the final resting place of George and Martha Washington.
Washington was a symbol for the new nation and republicanism in practice. His devotion to civic virtue made him an exemplary figure among early American politicians. At George Washington's funeral oration, Henry Lee said that he was, quote, "first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen."
While visiting Mount Vernon, don't miss the outbuildings and newly constructed slave quarters. The colonial Virginia economy was powered by slave labor. How exactly did this happen? Well, as we discussed in another episode of Drive Through History, the first Africans were brought to America by a Dutch trading ship shortly after the English founded Jamestown. These Africans were most likely treated as indentured servants. Almost half the white residents of the early colonies were poor Scottish, Irish, German, and English folks who became indentured servants, usually for 3 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to America. They tended to remain very poor because wealthy English elites had acquired all the best, most productive farmland. After a time, this lack of economic opportunity created a lower class of poor whites. Eventually, they became very frustrated and united with blacks in a violent uprising called Bacon's Rebellion. To prevent future uprisings, the Virginia colony elevated the status of poor whites above blacks by establishing, by law, lifelong slave status to blacks and their children. 100 years later, at the time of the American Revolution, the economy of the South had become completely dependent on African slave labor. And so, anti-slavery proponents in the North found it impossible to find agreement with the Southern states to approve the U.S. Constitution without essentially setting the issue of slavery aside for another day. Many of our founding fathers, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay, spoke forcefully against the evils of slavery and sought to end it, but the political power was just not there. And so our new nation and new constitution came into being flawed, with a terrible compromise. Slave owners Jefferson, Washington, and Madison each spoke out against slavery. For instance, Thomas Jefferson's early draft of the Declaration of Independence condemned the king for creating the institution of slavery, and it was Jefferson that penned the immortal words, "All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." George Washington wrote of slavery, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it." James Madison wrote, "If slavery as a national evil is to be abolished, and it be just that it be done at the national expense, the amount of the expense is not a paramount consideration." Washington, Jefferson, and Madison were all complicit in the horrible institution of slavery, and yet each man's writings would eventually be used to build the case that freedom was the birthright of every human being.
Hi, this is one big pumpkin. Lift with your back, not with your legs. Just kidding, mini pumpkin, so good times.
Thomas Jefferson's Monticello is located near Charlottesville, Virginia. Jefferson, of course, was the principal author of the United States Declaration of Independence, the third president of the United States, and founder of the University of Virginia.
Well, here we are at the base of Monticello, which means little mountain in Italiano. You know, back in the day, if you wanted to get to Thomas Jefferson's house, you'd have to either walk or ride a horse up this 850-foot little mountain. But today, I suggest using your right foot. Let's go. Thomas Jefferson used to play on these grounds when he was a mere boy. And in 1768, 8 years before the Declaration of Independence, he began to build his dream home. It was the South Pavilion he moved into first, 2 years later, an outbuilding here on the property.
The original home design was based on the classical style of Palladian architecture. Palladian architecture gets its name from Italian Renaissance genius Andrea Palladio, a man widely considered the most influential person in Western architecture. As a matter of fact, all the Georgian-style architecture we have seen in this Drive-Through History series, be it Christ Church or Independence Hall in Philadelphia, or George Washington's home at Mount Vernon, are all built according to Andrea Palladio's design principles. Palladio adhered to classical Roman ideas, which included strict mathematical principles. This style appealed to the rational Jefferson for its order, style, and symbolism.
This is the South Pavilion that Thomas Jefferson moved into while his dream home was being built. But what he really had in mind was this, the American version of the noble Italian villa sitting high atop his little mountain. It quickly became the elevated center of his own universe. Jefferson left Monticello after the war for some extensive traveling in Europe, but he came back greatly inspired to expand his vision for Monticello, incorporating some of the features of Palladian buildings and ruins he had seen overseas. Now, work began on the new design in 1796 and was substantially completed in 1809 with the completion of the dome. Jefferson spent 40 years tinkering with Monticello, saying, "Architecture is my delight, putting up and pulling down one of my favorite amusements." And you know, many people think that the building on the nickel was a huge influence on his design, but they'd be wrong. Yeah, like the Monkees are a huge influence on the Beatles. So.
The original main entrance is through the porch on the east. If you look up at the ceiling, you will see a wind direction plate connected to a weather vane. A clock face on the outside east-facing wall has only an hour hand, no minute hand. Jefferson figured that the time represented with the hour hand was accurate enough for his slaves. This clock is actually the back face of the Great Clock, which was designed by Jefferson himself for the entrance hall. Jefferson was something of a perfectionist, but the Great Clock at Monticello has an odd design flaw. It was originally designed for his Philadelphia home, which had a taller ceiling. The small cannonballs that power the clock indicate the day of the week as they descend down the wall. So here, Jefferson had to bore a hole in the floor to let the weights pass through. Thus, Saturday ended up in the Monticello basement. In Jefferson's time, the entrance hall was decorated with items collected by the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. Today, they are reproductions. Once inside the beautiful dome, I could see why the dome was so rarely used by Jefferson. The acoustics could drive you bonkers.
Here we are at the famous dome of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello.
Here's where classic architecture gets Americanized.
Jefferson spent much of his day answering letters, saying from sunrise to 1 or 2 o'clock, I am drudging at the writing table. It is estimated that he wrote 20,000 letters in his lifetime. Now, many of those letters were written in this very office, an innovative office of his own design. It featured a revolving bookstand, table, and chair. Also, a really cool copying machine he used to make duplicate sets of his letters. It was here that Jefferson wrote his friends, his political allies, his political enemies. He was also interested in every area of applied science and math, and wrote letters to scientists from around the world, all from this very office.
The South Wing includes Jefferson's private suite of rooms. The library holds many books in Jefferson's third library collection. The first collection was burned, and the second was sold to the Library of Congress. As famous and larger than life as Monticello seems, the house itself is actually not much larger than a large suburban home. The west facade is intentionally designed to give the impression of a more modest proportion, with a lower floor disguised in the hillside. The north wing includes the dining room and 2 guest bedrooms. A dumbwaiter is designed into the fireplace so that Jefferson and his guests could retrieve wine from the cellar without the aid of servants.
Some of Jefferson's 150 slaves lived and worked along this 1,000-foot-long road located on the mountaintop just south of the main house. Now, they called it Mulberry Row because of all these mulberry trees planted along it. And the road became a center for plantation activity. And now imagine this road, bustling with activity. There was a stable, a combination smokehouse dairy, a carpenter shop, a blacksmith shop, a nail-making shop. They also had a joinery, a sawmill, and some storehouses.
Most of these buildings are now gone, but a stone weaver's cottage has survived to this day. And you can see a tall chimney from the joinery. On the slope below Mulberry Row was a beautiful and extensive garden. Vegetable gardening was one of Jefferson's great passions. Thomas Jefferson planned so many small details of his life, including the epitaph on his grave. It reads as follows: "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia." What is perhaps most notable is what's missing. Did he forget he was the second vice president and third president of the United States? And
don't forget, when you're finished with your tour of Monticello, take the short drive down the road for lunch at the Mickey Tavern for some of the best food you'll find in Virginia. Take it from me, if you leave this place hungry, you've probably got worms. Just up the road a piece from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello is another estate known as Montpelier, the home of James Madison. Now, Madison was a lifelong friend and political ally of Thomas Jefferson. He was also a founding father with a brilliant intellect. He graduated from New Jersey College, what we now call Princeton University, completing a 4-year program in just 2 years.
That was easy.
For the next year, James Madison studied under the personal tutelage of clergyman John Witherspoon, the college's president. Now, the teacher and the mentor went on to sign the Declaration of Independence. The student, Madison, went on to become the 4th president of the United States. Now, Madison is also called the father of the United States Constitution, but he didn't care for that title. When asked about it, he protested that the document is not the offspring of any single mind, but the work of many heads and many hands. There we are, James Madison's Montpelier.
James Madison inherited this estate, Montpelier, after his father's death in 1801.
Unlike Monticello, Montpelier was heavily expanded and modified by its subsequent owners, the DuPont family. Now, the DuPont family expanded the home from 22 to 55 rooms. After exhaustive archaeological research, the home is just now being restored to the condition as the Madisons once knew it. The restoration involves the demolition of the additions and the restoration of the original home. For half a century, Mrs. Madison, who always called herself Dolly, was the most important woman in the social circles of America. To this day, she remains one of the best-known and best-loved ladies of the White House. Now, Dolly was raised under the strict discipline of a Quaker household, but there was nothing muting her happy personality and warm heart.
Although James Madison of Virginia was 17 years her senior and Episcopalian in background, they were married in September 1794. The marriage, though childless, was notably happy. "Our hearts understand each other," she assured him. Margaret Bayard Smith wrote about early Washington's social life. About Dolly Madison, she said, quote, "She looked a queen. It would be absolutely impossible for anyone to behave with more perfect propriety than she did."
Blessed with a desire to please, Dolly made her home the center of society when her husband began his 8 years as Jefferson's Secretary of State in 1801. She even assisted at the White House when the president called for her help in the receiving of ladies. And she presided at the very first inaugural ball in Washington when her husband became chief executive in 1809. Right behind me sits an extremely accurate recreation of her dining room here at Montpelier. Oh, hello. Dolly. James Madison was an American politician, a founding father, 4th President of the United States, and considered to be the father of the Constitution, and was the principal author of the document. In 1788, he wrote over a third of the Federalist Papers, still today considered to be the most influential commentary on the Constitution. He's also known as the father of the Bill of Rights. Now, this structure behind me, known as the Temple, was designed and built by Madison to be a place of contemplation, but being a practical man, he designed the space beneath it to serve as an ice house. Now, this structure has served for many years to be an iconic symbol of the Montpelier Estates. Welcome to the James Madison Landmark Forest. Let's make like a tree jet. Here at Montpelier is the James Madison Landmark Forest, a 200-acre grove of old-growth forest, one of the biggest and best preserved in the eastern United States. Now, if you want to see what the forests of colonial America must have looked like, you've got to come visit this place. Now, most of the wooded parts in the East Coast have been logged many times, so the trees aren't near as big as what you'll find here. The difference is amazing. Now, there's even a trail that runs right through the forest, so you can see these massive trees up close. This is a great place to stop and stretch your legs, get some exercise and some fresh air when you're driving through this part of Virginia. I'm at the slave cemetery here at Montpelier. Approximately 100 slaves staffed the estate during James Madison's tenure here. Many people recognize that the house itself is a testimony to their hard work. Many of them are buried in small, unmarked graves behind me.
The Madisons lived in pleasant retirement until he died in 1836. She returned to the capital in the autumn of 1837, and friends found tactful ways to supplement her diminished income. She remained in Washington until her death in 1849, honored and loved by all. The delightful personality of this unusual woman is a cherished part of this country's history.
Now, after his second term as president ended in 1817, Madison retired here to his estates at Montpelier. The fourth president of the United States, a man many called the father of the U.S. Constitution, died in 1836. He's laid to rest right here in his family cemetery at Montpelier. His wife, Dolly Madison, sold the estates after his death in 1844. She's laid to rest right next to him. One way to end the drought, schedule a drive-through history shoot. It's just good times.